it seems to me one of the first steps in, when new technology becomes available is just disseminating the information about what is now possible that didn't used to be possible, right? And that's part of what we're doing today. Here we are, I learned things just from the slides people sent me and the talks today, that I didn't realize we could do, in terms of genetics and tagging and, everything else. So, okay, so that is an issue, though, is how we get the information out on what's possible now that wasn't possible a few years ago. The other thing is, for each person, each of us has a set of research questions that we're trying to answer. There's something I want to know about, marine mammals. And how do we assess whether, or which technology, or whether the technologies we've seen today are appropriate to answer that question, right? In other words, maybe the perfect thing for you, if you're trying to do some sort of, biogeography of an animal, would be to talk to Phil and, learn how genetics could help you, for instance. But there's a step there of saying, gee, I know this technology exists, but how specifically would it help me answer my question? Right? And then the other thing is, once you decide that, oh boy, this really would be useful, how do you get access? Do you find a collaborator? Is there some technology transfer? Do you take Dorian to lunch and ask him to bring an AEP with him, or how do you do that? Because there's this process of somebody developing technology and then a lot of people needing or wanting to make use of it. And part of that is the issue you raised with Jim and the AEP. How do you make sure, if he just threw thousands of these things out there needs to be some way of acknowledging his contribution. And I go through this too, because there are people in my lab like Sean Wiggins that develop really cool technology, and I want to make sure that he's not taken for granted, that people recognize that he's done something that's helpful to them and that he gets credit for it. So those are 4 issues that and I'm not sure how the discussion will go today, but I think those are things we need to grapple with in terms of making new technology available. And well, I guess there's another one of how we discover where to go from here in terms of technology. And I think for us, a lot of it is where if we're open to interdisciplinary developments. In other words, AEP was developed for humans, right? It wasn't developed primarily for marine mammals. I don't know why, but people think humans are more important than dolphins, and so they develop stuff for them, right? And so then you can bring that technology over. Okay, so anyway, so those are just some questions, and maybe I don't want to sit here and pontificate or whatever. Maybe I'll open it up and see if somebody can. Maybe if we could start though with just sort of going through the talk, so we at least hit on all the points and talk about the genetic technology first, and if anybody has specific questions for Phil. Yeah.
When we talk about genetics, it seems like maybe there's an interplay between the genetics and the kind of stuff that Nick talked about, where you're applying a selective pressure to a species. For example, the animals getting continually encircled. It might not show up as a population, this small difference might not show up at a population level because of compensatory mechanisms, but you might be able to see it in the genetics. How would you kind of get those two together?
I'm not sure I understand what you're asking. Are you talking about
my favorite example is the domestication of the dog was probably kind of a self-selective process because people gave them an opportunity. But it wasn't just that they started getting closer and closer. All of these other genetic changes occurred at the same time.
Yeah. Well, we're definitely, as he said, we're kind of borrowing from what we learned from mostly human genetics, the modern organisms and agricultural genetics. So in those areas, people are looking at thousands of different genes simultaneously, being able to do it across different groups of animals and associating the variation in genetic markers with phenotypes. And so actually focusing in on the genes that are under selection in either natural situations or in artificial, like in breeding situations. And that's something we definitely would like to move towards. It's an order of magnitude beyond what we're doing now, but we're doing orders of magnitude beyond what we were doing a couple years ago. So it's not completely feasible that we could be doing that in the near future with populations, representations, and connecting it up with other. Yeah, it's a matter of all the different things that you can measure. Genetics is one component, and I'm talking only about DNA. There's RNA as well, and then there's the protein, and there's the hormones, and so we'd also not only like to look at the physiology and the genetics of the organisms and populations, but also then overlay those with the habitat use and the ecosystem variability. So all of these things need to be tied together, and it's at that point it really becomes a consortium. My area of expertise would never allow me to go out and put together all of the ecosystem variables and models. But that's why I have colleagues.
I've been wondering about, there's this push in human, probably medicine. Maybe in not too many years, we'll all get our genome sequenced. That sounds like science fiction, but maybe not, right? So, does that mean that in a few years, every biopsy sample we collect, it's going to make sense to sequence the whole damn thing? Where are we going?
It could be, absolutely. Already there are technologies to do a whole human genome in a matter of a couple of hours. And
I was going to say that's the processing bit of the flow processing.
Yeah. So if you can do that, and it's still on the order of thousands of dollars, but the goal is to have it under $1,000 and be able to do a genome in less than an hour within the next couple of years, and that probably will happen. And so these technologies are now very specific towards humans, and they can't just be applied directly to other species, but those are coming along.
So when that happens, how is it going to change our science? What are things that, what are the kind of questions we can ask then that we can't ask now?
You could do complete individual mapping of traits in populations in comparison to habitats, behaviors, things. I can't even imagine actually. Population geneticist, my brain doesn't go that far right now.
There are some, you can actually do population levels, just from the genome, so static DNA, you can actually kind of start to predict which populations might be more susceptible to particular genes, to certain types of defects, to hearing problems, that type of thing. That's coded stuff instead of reactive to the environment. But that is a possibility in the near future. Every single biopsy being the full genome being sequenced, and on top of that, the entire transcriptome being sequenced. So that would be the first stage. And what that tells you is the physiology of the cell that's at the time of the sample, what's going on, and predominantly it will be skin. And that will have some correlation to what's going on in the physiology of the animal.
You talked about using glows as a source of this kind. Can you elaborate on what's being done now?
Yeah, so there's two types of glow collection going on right now, and basically one is collecting the gas of the flow. That's a little bit more sophisticated, and that's similar to like a breathalyzer test. And then also collecting kind of the mucosal tissue, and that is a little bit different, but same idea. Those cell types and the gas itself will have signatures of particular disease. That's the idea.
There's also work going on looking at capturing other markers of stress in animals, nitric oxide being a big one that people are pursuing now. And I know of one group in particular that is trying to develop a device. They can do this now in animals held at facilities, but looking at a device that would allow them to do it in the wild. And so we'll have to see where that goes in the coming years. And they're also currently trying to figure out which one of the biomarkers actually correlate with altered physiological conditions in the animals.
What struck me about, Phil, what you had presented, which is interesting with the killer whales, was what this could mean for several different things, like our sense right now of species definitions and concepts, and how theoretically, when we start looking at these things a lot more closely, we can have the lumping, splitting argument, particularly at a really grand scale, and eventually globally. So the other thing that may play into for management would be things like evolutionarily significant units, and conservation of certain groups, and when they become significant within, can you have stocks that break down to smaller groups that really need to be vigilantly protected or something like that, and then that will obviously influence users of those areas. And I think this is kind of fascinating to me. I mean, in some ways, I'm sure there are some people that just say, I don't even want that information because it's going to complexify the whole thing to a great level. But I think it's kind of exciting at the same time that we can get really, really into the details of these populations.
Yeah. We spent a couple of years now talking about what is a species, what is a subspecies. When you don't have the classical definitions based on morphology and distribution and all that, we don't have that information. And so our only tool in many cases, our strongest tool, is the genetics. And that's sometimes is sufficient, and a lot of times not sufficient to really say are these two groups different populations, different subspecies, different species. So as we can generate more data from those groups, we can get more quantitative about what are these different groups and what is a species, what is a subspecies. And our main limitation is still the samples, but that's part of why we have been for 20 years, and slowly build enough samples and hopefully work with other people to get those together to be able to do that kind of broad scale analysis. And one thing, Barb's not here, but Barb Taylor has been looking at cetaceans relative to other mammals, and they're way undersplit. I mean, there are there are very few subspecies of cetaceans when you compare that to terrestrial mammals. And it's purely because we just don't know. So I think there will be a lot more splitting as we get the information.
As far as the genetic information goes, how are you comparing it? Are you looking at single nucleotide pairs? Are you looking at encoding regions? Or how are you comparing the different ones and then making the decisions on, this group is separate from this group genetically?
We're starting one step at a time. We started out with the mitochondrial genomes, and then you look at the whole mitochondrial genome and do various subsections of it to try to estimate both the best topology, the relationships between animals and groups, and the best information on divergence time. And with a lot of data, like the whole mitochondrial genome, you get the power to do those estimates much more precisely. But that only tells you something about the maternal lineage.
Right. And
then the next step is to look at the nuclear side. And our first approach is to use the sequencing technology to develop SNPs and then do the genotyping on large numbers of individuals across different populations to be able to do profiling of the different groups with nuclear SNPs. But again, that's what we can do now, and probably in the next couple of years, we'll just sequence the nuclear genes and use the sequences as our genetic markers. And we can use neutrally evolving genes, non-coding regions. We can use introns of genes. We can use actual coding regions, and we can pick out which genes we think are likely to be under selective diversifying selection versus those that are not, or maybe under stabilizing selection. And so we can actually focus in on perhaps the characters that are under selection. If it's reproductive genes or color patterns or sensory related genes.
That's amazing, by the way. Yeah.
One of the things that Nick and I were both at this omics consortium last summer.
Can you define omics, by the way?
Collect a lot of data. Genomics, proteomics.
I did that.
Yeah.
Different factors.
Metabolomics. It's really, there's no defined processing method per se. It's really a series of steps that allows you to look at a broad suite of information at once. Now, one of the major problems that people are very aware of is that we are already at a place where we can generate more data than we can analyze. And the omics field as a whole is pushing us further and further in that direction. As someone who just finished a metabolomics project with a dolphin, we came out of that project with over 300 metabolites to look at. That's fantastic, except now you have to go back and figure out what all that means by putting it in context of the physiological pathways that each of those metabolites are involved in, which is a very daunting task. And it gets no easier as you move from metabolomics to proteomics to genomics. So one of the big challenges we're going to face is how do we synthesize all this information, and how do we know what's important and and what's not, how everything's interrelated that we might not be thinking about as of now. So it's going to be a technological challenge of itself with respect to the way we analyze things, I think, here in the coming years.
I do think that's actually one of the 4 obstacles I had written as the omics procedures. And there are 2 things are in our advantage, and it is massive amounts of data, and it will grow even more. But there are places, and is already kind of a setup for data sharing, and CBI in itself is a good place to keep a lot of the expression data. I mean, that website has been evolving quickly and provided basically a center in which you can deposit DNA or data. And then at the same time, iterative approaches of similar type situations, conditions, as you get more expression profiles, as you learn a little bit more each time, even though you have a lot of data, just the iterative process of putting more data of a set of conditions, you learn a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more. And as this procedure keeps taking place, we will start to identify what metabolites are associated with what genes are associated with what. And it will come. It's just it's managing the data until that we get that point.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that. I'm having to become a bioinformatician, and we're having to buy new computer systems just to hold the data. Last October, we got 74 million reads in one day, 74 million sequences. And we had to process all of those, divide them up among individuals, keep track of them all in a database, and have the hard disk space and the analytical power to actually separate them. And that's taken up most of my year. Generating the data took a fraction of the time it takes just to process it.
Yeah, you're still asking for more samples.
But again, another good advantage is that we are behind. I mean, the nice thing about being in marine mammal biology is you're always behind what they're doing in human health. And that's nice because they've had the same problems, they dealt with the same things. There's a lot of money going to how to manage data, and we have many fewer samples, so we want more. And we're looking at, some of the things that we want to know are very basic compared to what they want to know in human health. I mean, a lot of times, it's been like, age or lactation or something like that seems really basic, would be a huge help in remembering.
So, in your slide, you sort of have the smoking gun in terms of the ETP, right? And that the overlap of fishing and the, low pregnancy rates and that kind of thing. I mean, so you can show that and people say, okay, there's an impact of human activity on these animal stuff. Right? Now, if there is an impact for Southern California, we need that smoking gun before we can convince people. Right? So, do you see this, in the sort of stuff you're doing? I mean, what's the path to that?
Yeah, I guess I haven't figured out anything more sophisticated than the same thing I did in the ETP, and it's really, again, so for instance, for sonar preference, getting a way to measure sonar. So in this case, this is a great link because there's a bunch of heart recorders all throughout the Southern California bight. There's an independent way of measuring sonar activity. And then we can correlate that to the amount, take a sample, look back in time, how much sonar activity was taking place in the days, months, weeks, hours, right before that biopsy was taken. And then be able to then see, okay, we take enough biopsies, we get enough to make a pregnancy rate estimation. Is the probability of being pregnant, is it inversely related to sonar? That's kind of my first step now. And that's pretty as sophisticated as I've gotten so far.
Yeah. Well, then there's the toxic side too.
Yeah,
right? There are all these stressors,
right.
And one of the tricky things is if there are all these synergistic effects. I guess we're getting off the new technology, but it spills over into the thing we were talking about yesterday.
Well, one thing to bring it back to the new technology issue is what I see is kind of a gap in all the incredible stuff you're talking about here is we're still not able to get at behavior in the way that someone who is a behavioral ecologist means behavior. And we've talked about getting diet profiles and stuff like that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about these kind of, you've got tribes of dolphins running all over the place. How are they interacting with each each other, or in your case of the dolphins in the Eastern Pack, social disruption is just as good a hypothesis for why you're seeing what you're seeing as some kind of physiological stress. So is there any thought of ways that we might be able to start getting at that isn't as human intensive as it is now?
Well, let's go to Greg in terms of field methods. How do you see things evolving?
Well, I think her last statement there was human intensive.
Yeah. Well,
and if you're trying to measure stressors.
But you've seen things. 10 years ago, we couldn't do what we're doing now in the field, right? And part of it, I credit you guys with developing an intuition just to how to get close to the animals, right?
But thank you.
Yeah. There's 10 years of investment in your brain to know, how to do it. But if you can kind of look into the future, what are we, if you're coming here 5 to 10 years from now, where are we going to be? We're going to be older. Right?
Back to the sea state thing that Dorian was talking about.
Yeah, and the electronics getting smaller has been a big deal.
It has, yeah. And you certainly could get to that question in some way, shape, or form by instrumenting a number of animals from a number of different groups to look at how they're interacting between each other. But I think, from a strict behavioral standpoint, in terms of the behavior of the individual animal, you're adding in you're introducing the potential tag effect, which I think would blur the line of being able to talk about social interaction, or you can look at dive behavior towards ecology in terms of.
Well, I'm just throwing this out to not just you guys, but to the assembled company as well. This is in primatology. No one would take the work that we do as behavioral biologists in marine mammals seriously, because we can't see the most basic kind of interactions that determine how the societies work.
Yeah, this is really sad because with Erin, this is for her thesis. She spent a good 4 or 5 years, working with John C., tagging as many blue whales as they could. And so maybe we had 25, 30 tags. And she writes a paper to animal behavior. And the thing gets slammed because she doesn't have enough data. It has, it's only 25 data points. Well, you want her to spend the next 30 years, on her thesis. It's crazy.
This is the point.
Yeah.
This is an area that really deserves a lot more focus and attention. This stuff is happening, and it's happening fast. Somebody needs to go, okay, this is something important to put our energy in.
So I'd like to interject somebody that we don't have on this panel, but would have been great to have here is Wayne Perryman, because he's using these remotely operated helicopters to go out and talk. Very remote. They're doing photography and filming cetaceans in the wild. It's still only at the surface right now, but there's still the potential there to use those as ways to tag animals, certainly getting photographs on film. So,
now, has anyone considered using post-processing at the surface at least that wouldn't work for tagging animals? Mari goes out and takes all these videos of huge schools of dolphins from airplanes, and I watch these schools of dolphins going, and it's just incredibly complex. And there's software that can analyze that. You could actually track the individual paths of dolphins as they interact, go apart together, interact with each other. We have these little Connect video games that can track people. Why couldn't we track thousands of creatures all at once?
Well, and the tags too. There are lots of wireless devices that talk to each other now, and I wonder about if, pretty soon you're going to have a focus on, okay, we got to tag 3 animals or 4 animals in the same group, and then the tags are telling each other, something about their relative position. They're working as an integrated, set of devices.
That's actually something that Bernie McConnell was working on up at Shrew for some time. SEALs trying to get them to have an integrated network where they can talk to one another. But does anybody know whatever happened with that?
Data offload, I think, is still the largest challenge that faces telemetry, at least in marine mammals or cetaceans. You either have short-term suction cup high-resolution data, which you have to recover and only tells a small snippet of the story, or they're relying on the Argos system, which is archaic.
Yeah, well, here's some science fiction, right?
Data limited.
Okay, so I'm going to make up some science fiction. But yeah. Okay, so we go out, and you've got some tags that you're going to tag multiple animals. Then I've got an ROV or a autonomous vehicle that can download data from those tags, and it kind of stays with them. So you get them all tagged, and then I chunk this thing in, and it follows the animals around, offloading the data, and then it can be the thing at the surface that's constantly, feeding us information. Right?
Or, John, what about your glider running the cow copy line?
Exactly.
If it has a receiver on it.
Yeah, but it's talking to Greg's tags. Right? So I'm just making this up.
Well, and some other technology that I think would really complement the Greg's tags is what Martin is working on, which is three-dimensional localization of animals using their vocalizations. And we've now got the tracking harps that we're putting out. So Martin can localize three-dimensionally where the animals are. We match that up with the tagged animal. We put those vocalizations onto your three-dimensional diet tracks. We can take some of my behavioral information, feed that into it, say, okay, what are they doing behaviorally? I mean, we have these things, we just have to start putting them together. Because your tags stay on so long, we can take the tag effect out after the first few days, and then we can track them acoustically and complement that with the dive behavior. I think we can do so much with that.
Yeah, I think there's still challenges because the lossiness of the Argos data and quite frankly the density of PBH peak whales that occur out in these basins. When we were out last week, we had encounters with 6 different groups, and we heard a number of other groups that we never even went to. The densities are pretty amazing. So I think it would be challenging. It would be doable with something like the DTAG, where you have really high resolution, especially if there's a GPS, which the version 3 should have, or we have the Mark 10 fast long tag. But where you can get the three-dimensional track from the tag itself, so you can create a good pseudo track. I think with rare species that are infrequently encountered, that would be a good place to start with what we're talking about. I think we could do it with the Xiphias, but I think there would be such holes because of the lossiness of the data.
Lossiness?
Well,
Gap.
Yeah, go ahead. Tom in the back.
Everybody's talking about how much data is being generated, so I'm curious what people's ideas or opinions on data sharing and data centers. And really, like John, you have huge, vast amounts of acoustic data, and Philip's got genetic data coming out the yin yang, and I'm sure Greg has tons of tag data.
No, this is why you should have come yesterday.
I missed it.
Yeah, well, but later today they'll be telling me that. But yeah, I agree that that's got to be a key thing, because there's value, in more than just the one investigator. Once you start to share, the value goes way up.
And I think one of the big issues is that we are generating so much data that the investigator can't deal with all of it. We've got more data than we can analyze. We can analyze it in so many different ways that after we get out that primary paper that says this is what the goal was, this is why we generated the data, there's still the opportunity for other people to do other things with it. And that's, I think, with genetic data is a great opportunity, probably with acoustic data as well.
Well, just as a for instance, we've developed biogeographic maps of song, right? And it turns out song is kind of more important than anything else. So it would be nice if the genetics back that up. So you could test the hypothesis of these song maps, right?
I think that can. Or you could. I think the marine mammal community as a whole is going through a cultural change, honestly. The physics community has been data sharing for decades. But the marine mammal community has generally been, I got this data, I'm going to hold on to it, come hell or high water, publish it. And it's been an issue for certain things. I mean, I know that people have been tagging whales for a long time that haven't published their data, are still sitting on it, it's a decade old. But as we acquire large amounts of data, it's almost going to have push us in that direction of sharing. There's going to be no other way to deal with it otherwise. But I don't know who's going to take the first step.
Yeah, so
I want to take a step back and play devil's advocate a little bit. Something that some of our forefathers have warned us about as far as scientists are concerned is becoming analysts, becoming so specialized that we sort of miss the point about the natural history of the animals, natural history of local areas. We sort of miss the big picture questions. And it seems like a lot of what we're getting excited about today is minutiae in some ways. Does anybody have any thoughts about how we can avoid missing the natural history as becoming analysts and specialists?
So, okay, so we have this argument at Scripps all the time, right? And so the two sides are, there are people who want to be holistic, right? See not only the animal and the environment that it's in, and then there are the pejorative term for the others are reductionists, right? They just want to slice out one little piece, right? But it's sort of I would like that argument to go away because we all think on all these different scales.
So do you think maybe the solution is collaboration, is data sharing, is the sum is greater than the
I would hope so, but it's I know that happens in almost all biology departments, and it's the difference between people who do genetics and cells versus ecologists. But hopefully it goes away. I don't know.
I do think training will basically. So if you think about lines, are almost like a collective, like where people are getting the minutia being at the very front lines, they're the ones gathering little bits of data. I do believe that in science there's going to be basically, and there already is a second wave of people who that's what they do. They put pieces together. And there'll be another, and they're theoretical folks kind of look at the broad picture. I think that will continue to evolve. It'll need better communication, definitely data sharing. But I think that's how science is going to get around this. Is basically it's really difficult because at the very end, at the front lines, it takes so much knowledge to be able to get this kind of sophisticated data. It's so hard then to also know the entire overview and well. And so I do think it's going to be, we're going to act more as a collective than a bunch of individual scientists.
So maybe it's obvious, but I think we have to get back to the questions we're asking. I mean, this session is tools. Okay? These guys all have great tools that can be used for probably various purposes. But the question here is about marine animals, the health, viability, and maybe some other questions. So I'll just use Dorian's presentation as an example. He presented the question, are we impairing behavior through sound? And the sub-question is, okay, we need to know the baseline before we can answer that question. That's a perfect example of how his new tool addresses that question. So I think if we get to those sub-questions for the other technologies, that path becomes a little clearer. We can't answer everything all at once.
I would say that we don't go after these tools just because they're cool.
Exactly.
We always have a question in mind and say, how can I get to this question?
That's right.
That's why we say, I'm going to try a new technology. I'm going to try something new or develop something.
And this technology has promise.
But I do think that there's an inefficiency by not realizing or not accepting the fact that you have a particular question, but you are gathering quite a bit of data, and not always what exactly goes to your question. There is, I think, a spot, let's say a niche for the ecology of scientists to be able to take the parts of data that aren't used preliminarily and make new assumptions. And we haven't been trained that way a lot in academic institutions, but I do think that that's going to be more and more. So there is question-based stuff for sure, but I do think that almost scavenging data will be a much more common occurrence in the future.
And I think that's particularly pertinent to outside of the lab, even in the field. Field operations are incredibly expensive. And often, if you go into the field and you're focused on one question, what's the behavioral ecology of beaked whales? If that's all you focus on, you're missing everything else that goes on around you. And so really as a community realizing that, hey, there's a group of offshore killer whales. Let's go collect some data for somebody else, and it's going to take an hour of our time, but the opportunity to do it again may not arise for years. I think as the field community, we really need to make sure that we don't get focused just on the one question.
My comment was not to limit the amount of science that's gone. It's really to John's original question: is how do we communicate what we're doing to a larger audience? If we just say we're collecting a bunch of data and here are the 30 applications, that's when we start to get lost in the mission. But if we identify some of these priority issues, and then people can see what the near-term product is.
Mari.
I think sometimes we miss the human component of all this and all the politics of it. And to integrate, like take for example Southern California, I think it'd be great to have a workshop where we could not just present what we're doing, but have an actual brainstorming workshop where we can actually make plans to integrate how we all can answer different components of a question. I mean, BRS is a great example of how you guys have integrated HARPs and tagging and all that, but there are other components too, I think, at least in Southern California, that could be integrated. And I haven't seen a platform really where we've been able to all get together and kind of do that yet.
This is the baby step in that direction.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, I'm with you that I wish we could just, make bigger steps, but here we are. I mean, we've created a community now. I think the onus on us is to get together and start to collaborate. Yeah.
I'm going to respond to that and what Nick had said. So there's a new wave or the next generation. Why can't we current grad students be that generation? You guys obviously are advisors sitting there and have pulled us together. As a second year, coming here the second time is now inherent that, okay, we collaborate. Obviously our dissertations have to stand alone and we do our own thing. Why not at the end of our dissertation we get told you now have to compile with someone who's not in your field. So, the two of you, Matt and I, the students, we compile, and maybe write something that's minimal as a note together, but we know what the other person's doing. And that's sort of a guaranteed collaboration. As part of your dissertation defense, you explain how your work would work with your classmates.
Can I go back a little bit to, you mentioned scavenging data. One thing that made me think of, at least my background is acoustics, is kind of the standardization that needs to happen in order for scavenging to work. You can't really compare things if everyone's not using standardized methods. So behaviorally, different words mean different, or same words mean different things. So I think that's kind of important to remember, is kind of standardizing terminology and things like that, especially in fields when we kind of throw them around like behavior and acoustics.
Yesterday we had the data sharing discussion, and one thing that didn't come up that I wanted to say is that publications have always been our way of communicating information, but they're pressing us to put less and less information into papers. And at the same time, we're generating more and more data and doing more and more complicated analyses. But since everything's electronic, there's the opportunity to put more and more information into supplementary material. And I think that's where we should be putting all of the information on how we did things, what are the quality controls, what are the definitions. You can put in dozens of tables in supplementary material and text that says, here's all the stuff that if you really want to understand my data and reanalyze it and integrate it, this is what you need to know. But the paper itself is just the usual.
Yeah. Do you think people are a little nervous about putting all their information somewhere?
They are.
Yeah.
I think that's what we need to overcome. We have to become more transparent, because when you're summarizing, you can't even put your data into a table. It becomes impossible to put into a paper now what you used to be able to, and make sense of it and have somebody else be able to say, I can understand that and use it. And so we just have to become more transparent, more willing to share it. And I think instead of scavenging, I prefer the term mining. It sounds better, but yeah, data mining is a skill into itself.
I do want to say one thing on top of that. I think two things. One is the biggest obstacle to sharing data in my mind is something that doesn't get talked about a lot. And I think a lot of people are scared that if they put their data out there, they've already produced a paper out of it. Somebody's going to find a mistake in it. I really do think that's the nasty little secret. It's hard to expose yourself, right? But I think what will happen is that it happens more and more. You realize everybody makes little mistakes, and it will be kind of a community. You start to realize that that's totally fine. It's okay to make mistakes. We're all human. And that will open it up more and more, and people will eventually be much happier to save data. Second note, I think it is really up to especially government labs, like Bill and I are part of, that we need to make sure that we get our data out there first. I mean, it really is the public data. We probably need to be the first groups to be doing that.
And to put together the infrastructure to make it available, because what you're describing, where it's in the supplemental material from some if you want to do a meta-analysis of a bunch of different papers, pulling that all out of these different supplemental materials is a big deal.
It is. I agree that the public databases are the way to go when they're available or that can be developed for that types of data.
And that gets at something else that I think is kind of important. With the technology right now, we're getting a lot of individual, kind of minute data that's very much down to the individual animal and special details about that. But one of the things that's, when we talk about this information overload, one of the things that was said by a guy named Marshall McLuhan was that when faced with information overload, we have to resort to pattern recognition. And I think right now, we don't necessarily make that jump. Or we'd like to make that jump, but we aren't there yet. And I think one of the things maybe we can work on with the technology is not only can the technology keep getting better and better, but can it bridge to these other things? Because like thinking about what Dorian was saying, a very small number of hearing measurements on some species doesn't profile the species very well. So maybe there's a better way to figure out, can we get this stuff not only simple, but out there, and then the people get the information, get it back, and then we all bring it together and say, this is the pattern for monocots or something like that. Some other things that then, like the Eastern Tropical Pacific, you've got the stuff for the pregnancy, you link it in with some of the other work on genetics, but then you start looking at some of the behavioral disruptions, you're actually eventually going to get to a much larger pattern. And we won't just have like one little piece of the puzzle or looking through the keyhole. Hopefully you can actually open the door and see the whole picture. And I think that's something right now that we haven't gotten to, which is there's a pattern there, but these technologies don't marry each other well enough to allow the pattern to come out.
So I'll just make a plug. I'm looking around the room, and I know this is the science panel, but for the management side and maybe the conservation side, which is kind of how do you even get the step beyond that, where now you've identified something. What's the application of it? What does finding different pregnancy rates in different areas of the ETP mean that we can now take into managing that fishery differently depending on where it is, for instance, or something like that. So I just think that plug that's maybe the next step to be thinking about, and having the scientific background to kind of take your work a little bit further and make those recommendations.
So I think the important thing from the management side is to identify what it is you need to know. If there's a question that you need to answer this question, and then make sure that the research and the new technology side knows this is the most important thing. Now, one way to let scientists know that something's important is to pay them to work on it, right? You get their attention when you hand them the dollar bill or whatever. So, but you don't want everything to be applied. But I think that would be a key thing is if, what are the questions that are really going to help you do your job better?
Actually, one additional point on that. I work in the philanthropic arena, and we cannot even specify how much philanthropic giving is attached to wildlife. It's not quantified. It's under 6% of all the, and what this tells me is that we have some work to do to convince people that the world isn't just human beings. That we're part of an integrated system, and we need to be looking at it that way and putting resources into it that way. The technology side is one of the most attention-getting parts of what we do. So doing a lot more to try to get out to the community. Gosh, look at all this cool stuff that we're doing. How about giving us a lift?
I mean, I agree that all of us could spend more time communicating, and then we're better off because the public is going to be more supportive of what we're doing.
We're finding ways of kind of making a cohort of us who do that, pulling from information that other people bring in. It's just, I think it gets at the question you asked yesterday, is how do we get this to be a priority now? And that's it. Get away from all the garbage they think about every day and start thinking about this.
There has been a couple of efforts like Compass and the NC's efforts and things like that to collect science outcomes and translate it and try and get some sort of better interaction with the public to change how giving and other kind of support takes place. I mean, you're absolutely right. We actually do a survey of private philanthropy every year, and the percentage that goes to marine conservation is minuscule. right? And religious charities get the big bunch, and then medical charities, and then athletic programs at academic institutions, and then academic programs at academic institutions, then ecology, and then down here about 2% of that is marine conservation in our annual survey. But we have to remember that a lot of these institutions, Nick made a good point, it's the public's data if it's a government lab, but it's also the public's data if it's ONR. It's also the public's data if it's scripts and pseudo-oceanography. It's, taxpayers subsidized by both the charitable contribution and by government grants to the institution. And so there's very little private data we have to accept as part of this. And so if we sort of open the floodgates and share and allow data mining and this communication to be combined with it, we may be able to substantially lift the amount of financial and other kinds of support. And this is where we're seeing things change. We see a pattern of more interest in the ocean, more giving related to the ocean, more donors coming from new sectors like the Silicon Valley .coms who care about the ocean, whereas other older philanthropists came from very terrestrial focus. So I think we're going to see a change as long as we're open to putting the stuff out there and communicating it in a way that allows that change to be supported. I mean, the Deepwater Horizon disaster, fundamentally changed how a lot of the public sees the ocean. Somebody like my mother telling me that they're talking about animals in the water column, and like, did you just say what I thought you said? Is an amazing shift that happened. And so we have to jump on this and run with it and open the data, communicate the data, allow it to be mined, and funders need to require it. ONR needs to require it. The government labs need to require it. The academic institutions need to require it of grad students. A little bit of this has to be top down.
But along those lines, though, is the perception also that what we're talking about here today, is it esoteric and obscure to most people? Yes. I mean, and so it's because at that point, and I know from my point of view, I get kind of a biased sample, but this kind of stuff is viewed as being sort of, in a nefarious way, a bunch of eggheads getting together talking about something that's really the public cannot get to, doesn't understand, and then on top of that, people in government and who are at the regulator level, and then that gets handed down a little bit, a lot of those people also don't know this or understand how it's applied, at which point we are more of a threat to sanity than we are to logic, available to talk about logic. And I think the Deepwater Horizon is a great example, because when they went out there to calculate the flow and somebody screwed it up the first time, professionals looked like idiots or looked like somebody was trying to suppress something, and that just didn't give a really great example of what we can do with great technology.
But just to respond to that, we have kind of a special position, we, the marine mammal community, because have you ever been on an airplane and the person sitting next to you says, what do you do? Right? And if you say, I work on whales, dolphins, they're going to just, do this. That's the other person heard, I mean, there's this huge well of interest. And so, so how you deal with it on the airplane is different. But we all have a responsibility to communicate to the public, and they're fascinated. Even when you tell them something you think is really trivial, they are fascinated and will, go on and on about it. So I think we haven't really exploited this to the level we should. And it's not just to get them interested in marine mammals, but it's the next layer down of this animal lives in the ocean, what's the state of the ocean, what's the state of the things that it eats, and all this kind of stuff. So I think it's an opportunity that we have that many scientific fields don't. But we can draw people in and get them excited, and we should. If we're not doing that, you have to say that to yourself. If you aren't personally involved in making that happen, then there's a missed opportunity.
You
Yeah.
take, I was going to say, you can take the other side, though, that fear is actually a much better motivator for people to donate, right? You start scaring people about what's happening in the oceans, might actually produce more involvement, and then leverage your position as.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying that people feel some sort of kindred spirit, whales and dolphins. And it's actually baffled me, the intensity of that, because I didn't start out in this field. I mean, so I can make up some really boring stuff when the person in the airplane says what you do.
So we talk a lot about making data available and making data public, but earlier in the conversation, we're also talking about the massive amounts of data, and as one who deals with a lot of those data, I can tell you, first of all, it's not nearly as interesting as going out on a boat and looking at whales. And so you have a limited number of people, I think, who are interested in dealing with it. And also, I mean, those are full-time jobs to get somebody to process your data, manage your data, put it up, get it exposed where people can access it. I mean, those are full-time jobs and positions. And how many of you have funding to hire people to do that with your data?
Very good point.
And the agencies and all these people who are requiring it are not giving you funding to hire somebody to do that. And it's not like the researcher just has to take half an hour out of his day and put it up on a website. I mean, it's literally a full-time job just to clean it up. It can take weeks, depending on the data and the amount of it, and then getting it on a website and vetting it and who's downloading it, what are they doing, making sure that it's accurate. I mean,
we
don't have the funding for it.
Yeah. Well, you have to educate the funders as to what it costs to do that, why it's important, and what the outcome is. Because otherwise, they see it as administrative overhead. That they're not. Everybody wants to fund the next exciting thing.
Right.
Everybody likes new payment. Nobody likes maintenance. And this is where you get into this problem. And so you've got to sell that job to the funder and say, this is important because, and the outcome of doing it right gets us here. I know that's not easy to suggest as your job to do, but it's the way to get it paid for.
I think we need to look at that as the final step instead of the publication being the final step. And that's the critical part. When you finish your dissertation, your goal is to get that published.
Right.
But there should be a step there as well. When you finish your dissertation, your goal is to get those data.
We're still talking about
hire you for
publication.
putting up a website. Universities hire you for the number of publications you put out.
Yeah.
Exactly. But
And we
you're
need that
absolutely
infrastructure.
right, because otherwise we can't do anything with it. I mean, we collect data on one animal a lot in this business, and the only way to make it useful is to have that as just a routine part of what we do.
Correct me if I'm wrong, and I don't know if Danielle is in here, but she mentioned like IUS and PACUS and all those that the government is trying to put in databases and kind of make that a format, a place to start, so that we can disseminate our data. And I'm not sure how far it goes, and so if anybody knows more about it, but I know it does oceanographic. It's oceanographic now, and I think they're trying to do acoustic stuff. At least I put in a grant for it recently. But yeah. So does anyone know more about that? About those databases?
The Ocean Observatory Initiative, you mean in general, and it's broken into all these regional observatories. Yeah. Well, they exist, and they're organizations that are kind of getting off the ground, and a little bit, it's focused on, creating an infrastructure. Like here's a mooring, and it's going to report data, or some other sort of network. And we, as a community, the marine mammal community, has not been strongly involved in this.
Right.
And I have to blame myself too. I mean, I went to a couple of meetings 10 years ago, and it didn't look like it was what's in it for me, kind of thing, and I never went back. So, but has anybody? Well, there's SCUS is the Southern California one, right? So.
Yeah, well, I've been involved recently a little bit turning at stranding data, put into it, and one of the issues that we're running into is the desire is really for real-time monitoring, knowing what's happening right now. And so by the time you go through the verification, validation, analysis, steps, your days, weeks, months, years past kind of what the interest was. So that's one challenge that we're facing that I imagine would apply to most of
Yeah.
analyst data.
Well, but in retrospect, we probably should have said something in this about SCMMW,
Yeah.
because they have a bunch of sensors that are out there that maybe people would benefit from. The radars that are looking at surface currents, and so because I think a lot of their funding is to track something when there's some situation, some event happens, like there's a sewage release, to be able to track it, that kind of thing. So that is a good point. I mean, that's a hole in what we did here, because we should talk about, and SCMMW is one of the more evolved of the regional networks. So next year we'll have SCMMW.
To reiterate the point that John C. made yesterday, and I think, as we're talking here about things that we missed in this workshop and making data public, and John pointed out that one of the issues with making data public, putting it into a publicly accessible database, is quality control of that data. And interpretation of that data without knowledge of how well it was collected. And I think in terms of technology, I go back to the idea that we have a bunch of people in this room who are in the same field who are looking at questions that relate to the Southern California Bight, and having a platform that we can communicate with as a group to say, this is what I'm working on. Like what Liz brought up earlier, there's this new technology that can look at movements of beak whales underwater, specifically to look at foraging behavior. And I can see that Erin is working on beak whales as well. I had no idea. I can contact her, and we can see how our data sets get put together. And then you have the continuity. Where did that data come from? How is it collected? What biases may or may not exist in that data set? The ability to network better within our community, I think, is the first step to a broader use of the data as a whole, and a better use of the data as a whole, than to simply just put it out.
I'm going to take that as a recommendation. Here's an action item, right? Because what you said is we've got to be able to communicate within our group about the technologies that are out there and how each of us are using them, right? Because then somebody who wasn't here today might realize, Greg Shore has this cool satellite tech, right? I mean, because sometimes people don't always read the literature, and the literature is years behind anyway, right? So when we stand up in, a couple hours and say, here's a definite recommendation that there be some, maybe it's a website or whatever platform for communication, that the technologies are part of that. There's a section about technology and how, people are using it.
And not even the technology, but the research questions too.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's not, Greg doesn't want to just, I have tags, and everyone wants to tag now, great, that's more work for you, but it's a specific research question that Greg's tag can answer, that someone else has worked on another piece. They can collaborate and put it together.
Right. I mean, it's a tool for collaboration within the community that still allows for integrity of the data set, and how it was, all of the things that go on with that, the metadata.
Mark.
I have a recommendation for how come this workshop maybe for SoCal is to somebody put together a table. If you have all the workshop participants, we could have another column that says, what are you working on in SoCal, specifically? And that would be one, which could be moved to a website or something like that. But that would be one way for all of us to kind of see what everybody else is doing.
So
how we could.
When you say, what are you working on, be more specific. So you've got a table of participants, and now what do we need to know about each participant?
What kind of research are you conducting? Doing capitalistic monitoring in the SoCal Basin, doing Navy contracts, doing observing from the flip, looking at animal behavior, that kind of thing.
Okay, well, so I think Liz would say, what's your research question?
Okay.
Right? And then maybe what are the tools?
Yeah.
Does that work?
Easy.
What are the
data?
What are the data?
And geographic.
Tools, geography.
Fieldwork platforms. Fieldwork platforms.
So it doesn't have to be separate. It actually should be ideally connected, that the data and the resources, the references, and the acknowledgments are all together. And I think OBIS already does that to some degree when people contribute their data to it.
Yeah, but the first step, which I think is easier for people, is the metadata. To say, at this place, at this time, I collected this kind of stuff. And then, if you really need it, you you can contact the person versus the actual, you know, here are the photographs, here's the set of data or whatever.
And that's the NC's tool.
Yeah.
That's the end.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's the metadata.
Well, and for that, you actually have to have data. What about those of us that are looking to collaborate that haven't published yet? It'd be nice to have names of people that we just started networking.
And that's where the value of Greg's recommendation comes into play. I agree.
I mean, it could almost even be tied into the Society for Marine Mammalogy members directory on a larger scale. You know, here's the researcher, here's their contact information. What exactly are you working on and what geographic region? Start there.
Well, but this kind of going back to my 4 questions or whatever. This is the third of my 4 questions. Kind of is if someone, you know, you're aware the technology exists. That's number 1. You realize it can help you in your project. That's number 2. Number 3 is how do you get access? Right? You either have to collaborate or, you know, somehow or technology transfer or whatever. So, but I think this website would allow you at least to contact the right person to try to, because I think that's a huge issue, is access.
I think that, I mean, that was my understanding of one of the things that NC's database was hoping to do. And what we did talk about yesterday was one of the most important things I think everybody, or a lot of people wanted, was a database just of who is doing what where, which is just what you're talking about now. A similar thing. And it sounded from what he was saying yesterday that the NC's database has, with their metadata database, even if you didn't have data, I'm not sure that you couldn't upload what you were working on and who you are and where you were. So some of the metadata, and to say we don't have data yet or looking for data or I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if that database exists, it could be used in that way. Might be worth looking into.
It's almost like we need a personals ad where you post what you're looking for.
Well, you can insert, but if you have a database, you can do a search on that. Well, it's like the person going on to math.com and search for all these criteria other people have already entered in, right? Yeah.
Desperately seeking aid.
No long-term attachment.
This is all.
I was just going to say also, if it's set up as its own entity that's pretty visible, it also creates a good opportunity for public outreach and education for this area, as well as potential funding.
There are very easy ways to set up these types of sites, even backed by NC's data or however you want to back it using Google Sites or any other host of website author, and you create a real social community site that takes you an hour to set up.
But I do believe we need a benefactor, which, you know, maybe the guys with the whale symbol. and we need somebody who's willing to be the backbone of it. So, and I don't think no one's jumped up and down to do that yet, but maybe that'll come out of this today.
Well, you need to make sure there aren't 5 different ones of these too, and just to have it regional probably isn't very good, because if you're working on beaked whales, you know, there isn't a huge population. Wouldn't you also want to be talking to people who are doing beaked whale research in other parts of the world?
No, but I think our focus really is that we're all occupying the same space. We go out in the same water, you know, look at, you know, some of the same animals. I think that's a real strength, because, you know, that's where, I mean, it's fine. We go to the marine mammal meetings, you know, and you can talk to people, you know, who are working somewhere else. But this group, the focus is that we're sharing essentially the same, you know, set of animals and piece of water. Right? Yeah.
I recommend going back again to it as if we're just having our focus, like you said, is SoCal. So we have maybe a product of this workshop. We do have, I assume we have some kind of funds, it sounds like, to produce some kind of end product. So put into there, that might take a day or two for somebody to put together that table, or maybe they fill out the table and solicit it and email it back to all these people to fill back in. I mean, that doesn't seem like it would be a huge amount of effort to do that.
I think you need a place to put it. You need a website to go to.
Well, so what you were saying before was the Google Docs, right? And I don't know how well they work, but that's something easy that, you know, you make an Excel form on Google Docs and email it out, and everybody can change it.
Yeah. So. And then something like OpenCMAP can take what we've done and integrate it into their, you know, their system or whatever.
Okay. We have a volunteer.
Well, just get an intern.
Okay, well, we're 3 minutes till nourishment. So I think we have said some definite recommendations, and they overlap a lot with what Dave's going to say. So maybe that's going to make the taskatory and I make it easy. We just say whatever Dave says. But I think it's really an exciting time. I mean, if you're a graduate student coming out now, the things you can do are so much more sophisticated than what you could do 10 or 20 years ago. So it's kind of a neat time to be coming into this field here too. And the technology is a key thing that's made that happen. Okay, so does anybody up here have any final words of wisdom?
Maybe we could find some volunteers to actually do this.
Yeah, you mean in terms of pulling together data?
Yeah, the table.
Yeah. Well, I think this session, I'm hopeful that something will come out of the thing this afternoon, where we look at all 4 of the sessions and we start to see where is there an overlap of things that need to be done, and then then we bow to our benefactor, or at least agree that we're going to continue a dialogue. Okay, anybody out there have any parting shots for us? Okay, well, I thank you all for coming, and I think it was, I was actually impressed just how well the talks kind of meshed together, and I think we had a really productive dialogue too. So we'll have to do this again sometime.